They say grief makes you vulnerable, but I never imagined how true that would become, until I watched my husband's brothers circle our home, like vultures the morning after the funeral, their eyes calculating the value of everything they saw. The accident happened on a Tuesday in October. We were driving back from our anniversary trip to the mountains, David humming along to the radio, while Sarah dozed in the back seat. 22 years old and just graduated from college, she had her whole life ahead of her. The semi-truck ran the red light at 50 miles per hour, and in an instant, everything I had ever loved was gone. Everything, except me. I survived with nothing more than a broken wrist and bruises that would fade. The doctors called it a miracle. I called it a curse. For 3 months, I lived in a haze of medication and casseroles from neighbors, barely aware of the world around me. The house felt like a museum of memories I couldn't bear to examine, filled with David's reading glasses still folded on the coffee table, and Sarah's favorite mug waiting in the kitchen cabinet. During those dark months, David's family surrounded me with what I mistook for love and support. His older brother Marcus came by daily, helping with paperwork and finances. His younger brother Paul would stop by with groceries and check on the house. Their wives, Jennifer and Susan, would sit with me for hours, holding my hands and listening to me cry. I thought I was blessed to have such caring family. The first sign came 4 months after the funeral. I was finally starting to emerge from my fog, trying to take control of my life again, when I discovered that Marcus had been paying my bills from his own account. When I asked him about it, he smiled gently and said he had been taking care of everything so I wouldn't have to worry. He showed me a folder thick with documents I didn't remember signing, all neat and organized. I felt grateful, but something nagged at me. A small voice that wondered why I hadn't been consulted about my own finances. 2 weeks later, I found Paul in my garage, loading boxes into his truck. When I asked what he was doing, he explained that he was just clearing out some of David's old tools and equipment that were taking up space. He said he thought I might want the garage cleaned out and that he could use some of the things for his own projects. I watched him drive away with my husband's carefully maintained workshop, the tools he had collected over 30 years of marriage. And I said nothing because I didn't want to seem ungrateful. The breaking point came on a sunny morning in late March. I had started to feel more like myself, even beginning to consider what I might do with the rest of my life. Sarah's college fund was substantial, money that would never be used for its intended purpose. David's life insurance had been generous. The house was paid off. I wasn't wealthy, but I was comfortable enough to pursue the art classes I had always wanted to take. Maybe travel to the places Sarah had dreamed of visiting. I was sipping coffee at my kitchen table when I decided to check my bank statements for the first time in months. The numbers on the screen made no sense. My savings account showed a balance of $1,200. David's life insurance money was gone. The fund we had set up for Sarah's future was empty. I stared at the screen for a long time, certain there had been a mistake. When I called the bank, the customer service representative patiently explained that Marcus held power of attorney and had been making regular transfers to cover what he described as estate expenses and medical bills. She read me a list of transactions that made my blood run cold. $20,000 to Marcus's construction company for home repairs I had never requested. $15,000 to Paul's wife's catering business for services I had never received. $8,000 to Jennifer for elder care management fees. The list went on and on. I hung up the phone and sat in my empty kitchen, finally understanding what had been happening. They hadn't been taking care of me out of love. They had been systematically draining every account I owned, using my grief as cover for theft. The gentle smiles, the concerned voices, the helpful gestures. It had all been an elaborate performance while they robbed me blind. The rage that filled me was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It burned through the fog of grief that had surrounded me for months, leaving me crystal clear and furious. These people had comforted me at my husband's funeral while planning to steal his legacy. They had held me while I cried about losing my daughter while stealing the money we had saved for her future. They had betrayed not just me, but the memory of the people I loved most. Later that day, I called Marcus and asked him to come over. When he arrived with his usual concerned expression and gentle tone, I was ready. I had printed out every bank statement, every transaction, every document I could find. I spread them across the dining room table like evidence at a trial. Marcus tried to maintain his facade at first, explaining that he had been protecting me from financial stress during my time of grief. He spoke about necessary expenses and wise investments, his voice smooth and practiced. But when I asked him to explain the $20,000 to his construction company for repairs to a house that looked exactly the same as it had 6 months ago, his composure cracked. The argument that followed was vicious and revealing. He accused me of being ungrateful after everything he had done for me. He suggested that grief had made me paranoid and confused. He reminded me that I had been barely functional and that someone had to make decisions. When I demanded he return my money, he laughed and told me that proving anything would be impossible since I had signed all the necessary documents. That night, I called David's old friend Robert, a retired attorney who had drawn up our wills years ago. Through tears of rage and humiliation, I explained what had happened. Robert listened quietly, then asked me to bring him every document I could find. He also recommended I start recording any future conversations with David's family, advice that proved invaluable. The next morning, Paul arrived unannounced with Susan and Jennifer. They had clearly coordinated their approach, speaking to me with the patronizing tone people use with children or the elderly. They suggested I was confused about the finances, that I didn't understand how expensive it was to maintain a household. Jennifer mentioned that she had been researching assisted living facilities that might be perfect for someone in my situation. I let them talk while I recorded everything on my phone. They painted a picture of a helpless widow who couldn't manage her own affairs, who needed family to step in and make the hard decisions. They spoke about my best interests while describing plans to sell my house and move me into a small apartment. They had it all figured out, right down to which possessions I would be allowed to keep. When they finished their presentation, I thanked them politely and said I needed time to think. After they left, I listened to the recording twice, hearing clearly for the first time how they really saw me. Not as a grieving wife and mother, not as a person deserving of respect and compassion, but as an obstacle to be managed and a resource to be drained. The following week, I took action. Robert had connected me with a forensic accountant and a criminal attorney who specialized in elder financial abuse. I opened new bank accounts at a different institution. I began documenting everything, creating a detailed timeline of every suspicious transaction and conversation. Meanwhile, I played the role Marcus and his brothers expected. I appeared confused and grateful when they visited. I asked simple questions about finances and seemed satisfied with vague answers. I even thanked Jennifer for researching those assisted living facilities, telling her I was grateful to have family looking out for me. 2 weeks later, I was ready to strike back. I had Robert send formal demand letters to all 3 brothers, detailing exactly how much money they owed me and demanding full repayment within 30 days. The letters were backed by evidence that would be difficult to dispute in court. Bank records, forged documents, recorded conversations where they had admitted to making decisions without my knowledge or consent. Marcus called within an hour of receiving his letter, his voice no longer gentle. He was furious, accusing me of being manipulated by lawyers who were just trying to profit from family drama. He warned me that fighting them would be expensive and emotionally devastating. He reminded me that I was alone now, that I would need family support as I got older, and that burning bridges would leave me isolated. Paul took a different approach when he called. He tried to guilt me, talking about how much time and energy he had invested in helping me through my grief. He mentioned the gas money he had spent driving to check on me, the hours he had devoted to managing my affairs. He made it sound like I owed them for their theft, as if stealing my money had been a favor they had graciously provided. Jennifer was the most calculated. She suggested that I was experiencing some kind of mental health crisis, brought on by grief and loneliness. She recommended that I see a therapist before making any rash decisions that might damage our family relationships permanently. She spoke about forgiveness and moving forward, painting herself as the peacemaker trying to hold everyone together. I listened to all of them, recorded everything, and said I needed time to consider their perspectives. What I was really doing was building a case that would be impossible for them to defend. The showdown came 6 weeks later. I invited all of them to dinner at my house, something I hadn't done since before the accident. They arrived expecting to find a defeated woman ready to accept whatever scraps they were willing to offer. Instead, they found me sitting at the head of my dining room table, with Robert and two other attorneys flanking me. I had prepared a presentation of my own. I walked them through every fraudulent transaction, every forged signature, every lie they had told. I played recordings of their conversations where they admitted to making financial decisions without my consent. I showed them copies of the criminal complaint I was prepared to file if they didn't agree to my terms immediately. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus tried to bluster, threatening to countersue for defamation. Paul looked sick. Jennifer kept glancing toward the door as if planning her escape. Susan started crying, claiming she had never wanted to be involved, but had been pressured by the others. My terms were simple. They would repay every penny they had stolen, with interest, within 60 days. They would transfer ownership of any property or assets they had purchased with my money. They would sign statements admitting to their theft and agreeing never to contact me again unless invited. If they met these conditions, I would not press criminal charges. If they refused or tried to negotiate, I would pursue them in both civil and criminal court. I would file complaints with the State Attorney General's office for elder abuse. I would contact their employers, their neighbors, their children's schools. I would make sure everyone in their lives knew exactly what kind of people they were. Marcus tried one last manipulation, invoking David's memory and suggesting that my husband would be ashamed of me for destroying his family. That's when I finally let my anger show. I told him that David would be disgusted by their behavior, that he had loved his brothers, and would be heartbroken to know they had used his death as an opportunity to rob his widow. I told them that every dollar they had stolen was taken not just from me, but from the memory of my daughter, whose future they had destroyed for their own greed. 2 months later, I had recovered most of my money. Marcus had to take out a second mortgage to pay his share. Paul sold his boat and motorcycle. Jennifer cleaned out her savings account. They had all underestimated how much documentation existed and how serious the legal consequences could be for elder financial abuse. More importantly, I had changed. The helpless widow they had preyed upon was gone, replaced by someone who knew her own worth and wouldn't tolerate disrespect. I had learned to trust my instincts again, to question people's motives, to demand transparency in all my relationships. The next morning, after our final meeting, I woke up in a house that felt like home for the first time since the accident. I still missed David and Sarah every day, but the crushing weight of betrayal had lifted. I was free to grieve properly, without the added burden of fighting off people who should have been supporting me. 6 months later, I sold the house where I had lived for 20 years. It held too many memories of both joy and betrayal. I bought a smaller place across town, close to the community college, where I had enrolled in art classes. I started volunteering at a legal aid clinic, helping other elderly people who had been targeted by financial predators. I never heard from Marcus, Paul, or their wives again, which was exactly what I wanted. They had shown me who they really were, and I believed them. Some relationships can be repaired, but some betrayals are too fundamental to forgive. When people reveal themselves to be willing to exploit your deepest pain for their own gain, there's no going back. The grief counselor I eventually started seeing helped me understand that what had happened wasn't really about money. It was about power and control. David's brothers had seen my vulnerability as an opportunity to diminish me, to reduce me to someone who needed their management. Taking my financial independence was just the first step in taking away my autonomy entirely. Fighting back hadn't just recovered my savings. It had recovered my sense of self. I remembered that I was more than just David's widow or Sarah's mother. I was a woman with intelligence, strength, and resources. I was someone who deserved to be treated with respect, not managed like an incompetent child. 2 years later, I ran into Susan at the grocery store. She approached hesitantly, clearly unsure whether I would acknowledge her. When she asked how I was doing, I told her honestly that I was happier than I had been in years. I had finished my first painting, made new friends at the art center, and was planning a trip to Italy that Sarah had always wanted to take. Susan looked uncomfortable, probably expecting me to express regret about the family rift or loneliness from being cut off from David's relatives. Instead, She saw someone who had built a life filled with purpose and joy. Someone who had learned to protect herself without becoming bitter or closed off to new relationships. As I drove home that day, I thought about the woman I had been in those dark months after the accident. She had been so desperate for connection, so afraid of being alone, that she had accepted any treatment as long as it came with the promise of family. She had confused exploitation with care, manipulation with love. The woman I am now knows the difference. I have learned to trust people slowly, to verify their actions against their words, to maintain boundaries even with people I care about. I have discovered that being alone is not the same as being lonely, and that some relationships cost more than their worth. Most importantly, I have learned that I am enough. My worth doesn't depend on other people's approval or presence in my life. I don't need to accept poor treatment to avoid abandonment, because I have learned to be good company for myself. The money I recovered allowed me to be generous in ways that brought me joy rather than resentment. I established a scholarship fund at Sarah's college for students studying abroad. I donated to organizations that help widows navigate the legal and financial challenges that follow the loss of a spouse. I used my resources to honor my family's memory while building a future that would make them proud. 3 years after that confrontation in my dining room, I can honestly say that being betrayed by David's family was one of the worst and best things that ever happened to me. It was devastating to learn that people I trusted were willing to exploit my grief for financial gain, but it was liberating to discover that I could protect myself, that I could fight back, and that I could build a life worth living without compromising my dignity or values. Every morning now, I wake up in my sunny kitchen and make coffee in Sarah's favorite mug. I look out at the garden I planted with flowers David would have loved. I plan my days according to my own desires and needs, not someone else's agenda or manipulation. I am alone, but I am not lonely. I am independent, but not isolated. I am strong in a way I never was before I learned to defend myself. The grief will always be with me. I will always miss my husband's laugh and my daughter's dreams. But I will never again mistake myself for helpless. And I will never again allow anyone to treat me as if my pain makes me disposable. I have learned that surviving isn't enough. Thriving means demanding better from the world and from the people in it. Starting with demanding better from myself.